December 11, 1941. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States of America. It was a decision that would seal the fate of the Third Reich. But here's the chilling part. Hitler wasn't worried. In fact, he was confident. He believed America was weak, divided, and incapable of fighting a real war. He thought American soldiers were soft, that American industry was overrated, that a nation of mongrels and Jews could never match the discipline and power of the Aryan war machine. He was catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how Nazi Germany completely misjudged America and how that miscalculation became the single greatest strategic blunder of World War II. To understand how badly Germany misjudged America, we need to step back to the 1930s. To the Nazis, the United States wasn't a serious power. It was a joke. Why? Let's start with the basics. First, America was isolationist. After the bloodbath of World War I, the American public wanted nothing to do with European conflicts. The U.S. military was tiny, ranked 17th in the world in 1939, smaller than Romania's. The American army had fewer than 200,000 troops. For comparison, Germany had over 4 million. Second, the Great Depression had devastated the American economy. Unemployment hit 25%, factories sat idle, farms failed. To the Nazis, America looked broken, a nation too busy with internal collapse to pose any external threat. Third, and most importantly, Nazi ideology itself was built on racial theories that fundamentally distorted their view of reality. Hitler and his inner circle believed in Aryan supremacy. They saw America as a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races, ethnicities, and religions that lacked the unity and purity necessary for greatness. In their eyes, a country with millions of African Americans, immigrants, and Jews could never organize an effective military force. They saw diversity as weakness. Hitler himself had written in Mein Kampf that Americans' Jewified culture had made it decadent and soft. He believed that Americans preferred jazz music and Hollywood films to discipline and sacrifice. He saw them as materialistic, undisciplined, and fundamentally unserious. German military planners reinforced these delusions. Intelligence reports emphasized American weaknesses: outdated equipment, undertrained soldiers, political division between interventionists and isolationists. One German general dismissed the U.S. Army as a militia barely capable of defending its own borders. Even after America began rearming in 1940, the Nazis weren't impressed. They looked at American tanks like the M3 Lee and laughed. They saw the chaos of American democratic debate and assumed it meant inefficiency. They fundamentally failed to grasp what lay beneath the surface: a sleeping industrial giant with virtually unlimited natural resources, a population of 132 million, and a democratic system that, once mobilized, could achieve things totalitarian regimes could only dream of. But there was one man in Germany who understood the truth. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had spent considerable time studying American industrial capacity. Unlike his Führer, Dönitz was a pragmatist. He looked at raw numbers, production statistics, and resource availability, and what he saw terrified him. In a 1940 memo to Hitler, Dönitz warned, "If the Americans enter this war, their industrial production alone will decide the outcome. We cannot sink ships faster than they can build them." He was ignored. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was equally dismissive when his own intelligence officers presented data on American aircraft production capabilities. "Propaganda numbers," he reportedly said. "No democracy can organize production on that scale." Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later write in his memoirs that the Nazi leadership suffered from a fundamental inability to comprehend the American character. They saw individualism and assumed selfishness. They saw debate and assumed paralysis. They saw capitalism and assumed greed would prevent collective action. They were about to learn otherwise. December 7, 1941. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed or damaged 21 ships and nearly 350 aircraft. It was a tactical victory for Japan, but strategically it was a catastrophic miscalculation, not just for Japan, but for their Axis partner, Germany. Within 24 hours, American recruitment centers were overwhelmed. Men lined up for blocks to enlist. A nation that had been bitterly divided between isolationists and interventionists was suddenly, completely unified. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, but privately, some of his advisors wondered, would the American people have the stomach for a long, brutal war? They didn't have to wonder long. 4 days later, on December 11th, Adolf Hitler made the decision that would doom the Third Reich. Standing before the Reichstag, he declared war on the United States. He didn't have to. The Tripartite Pact with Japan only required Germany to defend Japan if Japan were attacked, not if Japan was the aggressor. Hitler could have stayed out of it, forcing America to focus entirely on the Pacific. Instead, he chose confrontation. Why? Because he genuinely believed Germany would win. He thought America was too weak, too divided, and too far away to matter. He assumed the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic would strangle any attempt to send forces to Europe. And most critically, he believed the Soviet Union would fall within months, freeing Germany to deal with any American threat at its leisure. He was wrong on every count. What happened next was unlike anything the world had ever seen. America didn't just mobilize for war. It transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, an industrial juggernaut operating on a scale that defied comprehension. Let's talk numbers, real numbers, because this is where German intelligence failed most spectacularly. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States produced 4,052 military aircraft. The Nazis looked at this and weren't impressed. Germany had produced over 11,000 that same year. But here's what they missed. American production wasn't limited by resources or industrial capacity. It was limited only by the decision to ramp up. And once that decision was made, the floodgates opened. By 1944, America was producing 96,318 aircraft per year. That's more than 26 aircraft every single hour around the clock. For comparison, Germany's peak production was 39,807 in 1944, and that was while under constant Allied bombing. But it wasn't just planes. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 297,000 aircraft of all types, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, 5,200 major warships, 2,710 Liberty ships, cargo vessels built so quickly that one was completed every 42 hours on average, 64,500 landing craft, and 6,500 naval vessels of all types. And here's the truly staggering part. America did this while also supplying the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, rebuilding Britain's shattered forces, feeding civilian populations across Europe, and maintaining a two-ocean war. The secret was resources and geography. America had oil, lots of it, domestically produced petroleum that couldn't be bombed by enemy aircraft. Germany was constantly rationing fuel, while American tanks and planes never wanted for gasoline. America had steel. The mills of Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana alone outproduced Germany's entire industrial base. America had food. While German civilians were on ration cards and facing increasing hunger by 1943, American agricultural output actually increased during the war. The U.S. not only fed its own military and population, but also shipped food to Britain and the Soviet Union. And critically, America had security. German factories were being pounded into rubble by Allied bombers. Soviet industry had to be evacuated east of the Urals to escape Wehrmacht advances. But American factories? Untouchable. Protected by two oceans, they operated 24 hours a day without fear of air raids. This was the reality Nazi Germany had refused to see. But industrial capacity alone doesn't win wars. You need people. And here, too, Germany had completely misread the situation. The Nazis believed American society was too soft, too individualistic, too divided to make the sacrifices necessary for total war. They thought Americans would balk at rationing, resist conscription, and demand their creature comforts. They were wrong. 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II, out of a population of 132 million. That's more than 12% of the entire nation. For comparison, Germany mobilized about 18 million from a population of 69 million. Proportionally more, yes, but from a much smaller base. But on the home front, where American determination truly showed, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants. The symbol of Rosie the Riveter became iconic, but she represented a real phenomenon. 6 million women working in war industries, many of them operating heavy machinery, welding ships, and assembling bombers. Americans accepted rationing of sugar, coffee, meat, butter, and gasoline without significant resistance. Scrap metal drives collected everything from old cars to backyard fences. Children collected milkweed pods for life jacket stuffing. Victory gardens produced 40% of all vegetables consumed in the U.S. by 1944. This wasn't the soft, decadent society the Nazis had imagined. But what about the soldiers themselves? The Nazis had convinced themselves that American troops would be inferior warriors, undisciplined, poorly trained, and lacking the combat spirit of German soldiers forged in years of warfare. The early encounters seemed to confirm this belief. When American forces first faced the Wehrmacht in North Africa in February 1943 at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, they were badly mauled. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps tore through inexperienced American units, inflicting over 6,000 casualties and capturing hundreds of vehicles. German commanders sent confident reports back to Berlin. The Americans fight without conviction. They are not serious soldiers. But they mistook inexperience for permanent incapacity, and that was a fatal error. The American military had something the German army didn't: the ability to learn from mistakes quickly, adapt tactics, and promote based on merit rather than social class or party loyalty. After Kasserine Pass, General Dwight D. Eisenhower relieved incompetent commanders and installed aggressive leaders like George S. Patton. Training methods were revised, doctrine was updated, equipment deficiencies were addressed. By the time American forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, they were a different army. At Normandy in June 1944, they were a different army again, better trained, better equipped, and increasingly experienced. German commanders began revising their assessments. One Wehrmacht officer wrote in late 1944, "The American soldier has proven far more resilient than we anticipated. Their artillery is overwhelming, their air support is omnipresent, and their logistics are impeccable. We cannot match them in any of these areas." That last point, logistics, was critical. The German military ran on captured fuel and repurposed enemy equipment. They still used horses to move much of their artillery and supplies. By contrast, American forces were fully motorized. Every infantry division had organic transport. American quartermasters could move supplies from American factories to front-line troops in France with staggering efficiency. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "We didn't just outfight the Germans, we out-organized them, out-supplied them, and out-produced them. They were a 19th century army trying to fight a 20th century war." And then there was the matter of firepower. The American military philosophy emphasized firepower over manpower. Why send infantry into a fortified position when you can flatten it with artillery first? American artillery doctrine was devastatingly effective. Time-on-target missions allowed multiple batteries to fire from different locations, so all shells arrived simultaneously, giving the enemy no warning. American forward observers called in fire missions with shocking speed and accuracy. One German soldier captured after the Battle of the Bulge told his interrogators, "You Americans don't fight, you just call down artillery and let the shells do your fighting for you." He meant it as an insult, but he'd actually identified exactly why American forces were so effective. Why sacrifice soldiers when you have shells? The Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war wrote in his memoir, "After 1943, we never saw the sky without American aircraft. They were everywhere, all the time. We couldn't move by day, we couldn't resupply, we couldn't reinforce. The Americans owned the air completely." This was possible because American industrial might produced aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. Even accounting for losses, American air strength grew throughout the war while Germany's shrank. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was largely grounded, not from lack of pilots or planes, but from lack of fuel. Meanwhile, American strategic bombing ran round-the-clock missions, British Bomber Command by night, the U.S. 8th Air Force by day. German cities, factories, and transportation networks were systematically destroyed. How did German intelligence get it so wrong? The answer is uncomfortable. They saw what they wanted to see. This is called confirmation bias, and it poisoned Nazi assessments of America from the beginning. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, did collect accurate data on American production capacity. Reports from German embassy staff in Washington before the war, information from technical journals, even public statements from American industrialists, all of this painted a clear picture of America's potential. But when these reports reached decision-makers, they were filtered through ideological assumptions. Numbers that contradicted Nazi racial theories were dismissed as Jewish propaganda or American boasting. Intelligence officers who warned about American capabilities were ignored or reassigned. This wasn't unique to Germany. Japan made similar mistakes about American resolve after Pearl Harbor. Totalitarian regimes often suffer from this problem. When you punish bearers of bad news, you stop receiving accurate information. Meanwhile, Hitler surrounded himself with yes-men who reinforced his delusions. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, fed him reports emphasizing American political divisions, racial tensions, and union strikes. The message was always the same: America is weak, America is divided, America cannot sustain a war effort. Even as late as 1944, with American armies advancing across France, Nazi propaganda still depicted the United States as a mongrel nation on the verge of internal collapse. Newsreels showed cherry-picked footage of American race riots and labor disputes, ignoring the overwhelming tide of American military and industrial power. Hitler himself remained in denial almost until the end. In his bunker in April 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away, he was still talking about wondered weapons that would turn the tide and predictions that the American-Soviet alliance would collapse into conflict, allowing Germany to negotiate a separate peace. He failed to understand that the one thing Americans and Soviets agreed on was Germany's unconditional surrender. But perhaps the deepest miscalculation was philosophical. The Nazis believed that democracy made societies weak. They thought that giving people freedom made them selfish and undisciplined. They assumed that only through authoritarian control, military discipline, and racial purity could a nation achieve greatness. World War II proved the opposite. Free societies, when threatened, mobilize more effectively than dictatorships. Why? Because people who fight by choice fight harder than people who fight because they're forced to. Because democratic institutions, for all their messiness and inefficiency in peacetime, can achieve remarkable things when the population is genuinely united behind a cause. Americans in World War II weren't fighting because a dictator told them to. They were fighting because they believed in something, that fascism was an existential threat to human freedom, that what happened in Europe and Asia mattered, that some things are worth fighting for. This gave American forces a moral clarity that German soldiers fighting for a regime built on racial supremacy and conquest increasingly lacked. As the war dragged on, German troops fighting on the Eastern Front were motivated more by fear of Soviet revenge than belief in Nazi ideology. In the West, Wehrmacht soldiers increasingly knew they were fighting for a lost cause. American troops, by contrast, knew exactly why they were there. They were liberating Europe. They were defeating fascism. They were protecting democracy. This wasn't propaganda. It was genuine conviction, reinforced every time they entered a liberated town or opened a concentration camp. The Nazis had predicted that American soldiers would give up when the fighting got hard. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive designed to split Allied forces and cause American casualties so severe that the U.S. public would demand a negotiated peace. It failed. Not just militarily, though it certainly failed militarily, but psychologically. American forces held the line at Bastogne. They counterattacked in brutal winter conditions. They gave no ground. And the American public, far from demanding peace, demanded victory. By 1945, American war production was still accelerating. More planes, more tanks, more ships. The United States had mobilized barely 60% of its total industrial capacity. There was no war weariness, no political movement to negotiate. Americans had decided that the war would end with Germany's complete and unconditional surrender, and nothing would change that decision.
This was the reality Nazi Germany had never imagined possible. A democratic society proving more ruthless, more determined, and more capable of total war than a totalitarian military state. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war that Hitler thought would last a few months and end in German victory had lasted nearly 6 years and ended in complete destruction. The human cost was staggering. Over 400,000 Americans killed, 5 million German military dead, plus millions of civilians. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people. The Holocaust claimed 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. But our focus here is on strategic miscalculation, and the numbers tell a brutal story. Germany produced 67,000 military aircraft during the entire war. America produced 300,000. Germany built 25,000 tanks. America built 88,000. Germany's total war expenditure was approximately $270 billion in 1940 dollars. America spent $296 billion and had money left over to rebuild Europe afterward through the Marshall Plan. In every measurable category, Germany was outproduced, outfought, and outlasted. The mongrel nation of immigrants that Hitler had dismissed as weak had proven itself the most formidable military-industrial power in human history. After the war, Allied interrogators interviewed captured German military leaders. The transcripts make for fascinating reading. Almost to a man, they admitted they had underestimated American capabilities. Admiral Dönitz said his warnings about American shipbuilding capacity had been far too conservative. General Alfred Jodl admitted that Hitler's political racial framework had made it impossible for German planners to assess America accurately. Even Hermann Göring, that buffoonish architect of the Luftwaffe's destruction, admitted at Nuremberg, "We never understood what we were up against." Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, and one of the few Nazi leaders with genuine technical competence, was perhaps most candid. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Hitler made his worst mistake when he declared war on America. From that moment, our defeat was certain. Not in 5 years, not in 10, but certain nonetheless. The Americans had everything we lacked: limitless resources, unassailable geography, a motivated population, and industrial capacity that made our own look medieval. We were trying to fight the entire world with the economy of a single European nation. It was madness." Speer also noted something else. The Nazis had been so blinded by ideology that they'd wasted resources on wonder weapons and prestige projects rather than focusing on practical mass production. Germany developed the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262, but built only 1,400 of them. Imagine if those resources had gone to conventional fighters instead. It still wouldn't have been enough, because America would have just built more planes, but it illustrates the point. Germany was playing a different game than America was. Germany was trying to achieve technological superiority. America was achieving quantitative dominance. In the end, it didn't matter how advanced your tanks were if the enemy had 5 times as many. It didn't matter how brave your soldiers were if the enemy could call down 10 times more artillery. It didn't matter how brilliant your generals were if the enemy controlled the skies, the seas, and the logistics networks. War in the industrial age is ultimately about mathematics. Germany couldn't do the math. Or rather, they could, but they chose not to believe the answer. So what can we learn from Nazi Germany's catastrophic misjudgment of America? First, never let ideology blind you to reality. The Nazis' racial theories prevented them from accurately assessing American potential. They saw diversity as weakness when in fact it was a source of strength. They saw democracy as chaos when in fact it enabled flexibility and adaptation. They saw capitalism as greed when in fact it unleashed productive capacity beyond anything a centrally planned economy could achieve. This is a lesson that applies far beyond World War II. Anytime leaders prioritize ideology over evidence, disaster follows. Anytime intelligence agencies tell leaders only what they want to hear, strategic surprise becomes inevitable.
Second, never underestimate a sleeping giant. America in 1939 looked weak. Small military, Depression-era economy, isolationist politics. But underneath was enormous latent capacity. Germany mistook peacetime weakness for permanent incapacity. They failed to ask what happens if this nation fully mobilizes. Third, geography matters a lot. Germany was surrounded by enemies and resource poor. America was protected by oceans and resource rich. No amount of military genius could overcome that fundamental imbalance. Fourth, in modern warfare, industrial capacity determines outcomes more than battlefield tactics. Germany had brilliant generals, well-trained soldiers, and sophisticated weapons. America had factories that produced material faster than Germany could destroy it. America won. And fifth, free societies are more resilient than dictatorships. This is perhaps the most important lesson and the hardest for authoritarians to accept. Democratic nations can seem weak, divided, and inefficient in peacetime, but when genuinely threatened, they mobilize with terrifying effectiveness. Why? Because people fight harder when they're fighting for something they believe in rather than something they're told to believe in. The cost of Germany's miscalculation was borne not just by the Allies who fought and died to defeat fascism, but by the German people themselves. German cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of German soldiers died in a war they could not win. German civilians suffered occupation, division, and decades of rebuilding, all because their leaders believed a comforting lie that America was weak. The veterans who fought that war, American, British, Soviet, and others, understood what was at stake. They weren't just fighting Germany, they were fighting an ideology that said some humans were superior to others, that might made right, that democracy was weakness and dictatorship was strength. They proved with blood and steel and unimaginable sacrifice that those ideas were false. Today, fewer than 100,000 American World War II veterans remain alive. They're in their late 90s and past 100. Soon, there will be none. But their legacy endures. They didn't just defeat Nazi Germany, they defended a proposition that freedom, democracy, and human equality are worth fighting for, that diversity is strength, not weakness, that free people, united by common purpose, can achieve extraordinary things. Nazi Germany misjudged America because they couldn't imagine that such a proposition could be powerful. They learned otherwise, and the world is better for it. December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, confident that Germany would triumph. Within 3.5 years, Germany lay in ruins, Hitler was dead, and American forces occupied Berlin. The Nazis had believed their own propaganda. They'd convinced themselves that racial purity mattered more than industrial capacity, that dictatorship was more efficient than democracy, that Americans were too soft to fight. They were wrong about everything. And that miscalculation didn't just cost Germany the war, it cost millions of lives, destroyed a continent, and discredited their ideology so thoroughly that even today, 80 years later, Nazism remains synonymous with evil, all because they misjudged America. History has a lesson here for anyone willing to listen. Never confuse peacetime complacency with permanent weakness. Never assume that free people can't make hard choices when threatened. And never, ever let ideology blind you to reality, because reality always wins in the end.